do this goofy dance and I don't need to, but it's just mandatory at this point. So, welcome, my friends, to another Soul Connection call. I am so delighted to be back in the studio again, this time with another first time we've never met face to face before guest. So, I love doing these live conversations and getting to know someone right alongside you. So, Rachel, if you would go ahead and introduce yourself, that would be so wonderful.
Yes, thank you so much for having me. My name's Rachel Warmath. I am a writer and book editor based in Salt Lake City, Utah. And I recently published my first memoir, and that's been just such a fun, incredible journey. So that's kind of top of mind when I think of introducing myself. I think I'm finally a memoirist. I've thought about doing it for quite a while, so here we are.
So amazing. I'm so I've seen so much of what you're doing to put this memoir out there. It's just incredible. So thank you for sharing your story with the world. And memoir is so vulnerable. So thank you for that vulnerability. Oh my gosh. And I know we're going to get into that a ton. So just to introduce myself, I'm Safrianna Lughna, the Queer Spirit Guide. I'm also an author. My most recent publication was my debut poetry collection, which is a memoir in poetry about overcoming my own trauma history, especially relationship trauma. So I am all about writing. I do some editing as well. And my big dream is to be publishing my sci-fi and fantasy series and kind of not leave the service industry behind, but not have it be as forward for me. So our topic today is how creativity and wellness meet. And Rachel, we've never really talked in depth before. We've had a couple DMs, we've commented on each other's socials, but just to give you a little orientation. So I was an English school teacher, and then I was a trauma therapist.
Wow.
And now and now I'm doing the running a podcast and a brand and a focusing on my writing thing. And so when you proposed this topic of creativity and wellness, of course, I was like, "Oh, heck yeah, let's talk about that." Because not only have I worked with clients, but I've also had my own journey of needing to improve my own health, right? In order to allow creativity to flow through. So I'm just curious, what's your creative history and how did you get to landing here now? Because I imagine it hasn't just been smooth sailing, easy peasy.
Yes, it has been an interesting journey, a wild ride, as all of us experience in life. Um, I really, it was about 4 years ago when the pandemic happened that things kind of started to click for me in terms of recognizing that interplay between creativity and wellness. And I didn't expect to be out there doing it, but I really got into running. And I started with just walking. I was going crazy, being home all day, working from home, and just needed to get outside and go for a walk. But then eventually I just kind of slowly built into running. Eventually I did some different marathons. I ran an ultra marathon back in spring of 21. And at that same time that I was becoming more in tune with my body and kind of taking care of myself at this new level, of trying to reach these ambitious running goals, my creativity was off the charts. And I was finding this confidence where I realized, man, I want to write books, and I had thought about doing that my whole life. I was a writer in school and loved my English classes, started college as a journalism major, ended up finishing with an English degree and a focus in poetry. So I'm right there with you on the poetic memoir idea. But anyways, so it kind of clicked for me that taking care of my body and prioritizing my healing was also contributing to my confidence as a writer and this new identity of, I'm not just a writer who writes at home for myself, but I actually put my words out there and share my stories and, connect with different writing communities. And so that was kind of, that 2020, 2021 time frame was really a pivot for me.
I bet. I bet. I mean, I know it was for so many of us. And yeah, it's interesting. I didn't really publish until the pandemic. It's like I was sitting on all of these projects, and my first novel that I wrote, not my first novel I wrote, my first novel I published, my first novel I wrote, it's been like 15 plus years. But my first novel that I wrote and published was actually during the pandemic, and I brought it forward towards the end. And like, it just was it was like that whole experience was pushing me, like, we needed to get our voices out there more, we needed to live more authentically. And I think that a lot of us had that moment of, A, how is my health, right? Our health was being called into question in many ways. And
Yes.
B, like, am I filling my time with things that are actually meaningful for me? Because our sense of time really shifted. So I love that you have had this physical alignment piece that's really, and that I see you speak to that in your writing publicly a lot. Like, you're inviting people to consider their movement practices and how that ties into their writing. And for me, I'm like the most movement resistant person ever. And I know that's because, like, I have physical trauma, and anybody with physical trauma, like, I really feel for you because it does make it more challenging to get in our bodies and do physical things. So my focus has always been more the shadow work and like doing the mindset stuff and like what beliefs are blocking me here. So I think it's just fun that we have these different angles. Like, I know you don't discount that because I see you do it too, and you're a writer, so you have to do the shadow work. But that that there are multiple layers to this wellness piece, right? It is our physical wellness, it is our emotional and mental wellness. And I really think that the spiritual wellness has a lot to do with that creative expression, because outside of religion, outside of any traditional views, our spirituality is our creative force.
Mhm.
And so we kind of need these other layers in place. So I'm curious specifically for you, since you have that physical lens, if somebody was, they want to create, but their body is feeling like junk, right? We know that that is a barrier. So how do you encourage people to start to thaw those barriers?
Mhm. Yeah, so for me, the two that come to mind are walking and yoga. Um, I so I was telling you that story about being a runner back in 2020 time period. Since then, I've shifted a lot more into walking than I have running. And part of it, I think, is just being later in my 30s and my body slowing down a bit. Um, but also this sense of wanting to take a bit slower pace in life and take time, to observe what's around me and enjoy being in nature and things like that. And I've actually been doing a practice for the last 4 months or so of walking and then writing every single day. And I noticed that the circulation aspect of a good walk, instead of taking like a really leisurely pace, just kind of taking that pace up a little bit and getting the blood flowing seems to make quite a difference in just how my energy feels when I go to sit down and be still. So I think if you're brand new or like struggling to get out and exercise, walking can be a really great option because it's very natural, as a human to be able to walk. Um, Although, I recognize not everyone can walk, and so um, that makes me even more grateful that I can.
Yeah.
Um, and then also gentle yoga is a great option, and there's a lot of yoga out there in the Western world that's very vigorous and challenging. And you can also find much slower classes where you aren't going to move a ton, but you're focusing more on opening up the energy channels and restoring the body in ways that would support trauma healing and things like that. Um,
Yeah. Thank you for noting that. And I always recommend, like, if you are bedbound or mobile, like you don't have mobility, you can always try chair yoga
mhm.
as a practice. Chair yoga can be vigorous for able-bodied people, so take it slow, like,
Yeah.
but finding those little things, for me, I have chronic pain,
Hmm.
and sometimes do have mobility issues, and I find that even if I can just like do some pelvis sort of circles or roll my
Yeah.
neck or my shoulders or just get a little bit of movement into my body, that, yeah, like that energy flows more clearly and we can create. And I love that you brought in like the chakras. So when we get out and we walk, what's really interesting is not only do we have the bilateral stimulation, so
Yes.
that's my therapist background here, right? Like the bilateral stimulation actually helps our brain filter information better and
Mhm.
get it all the way through the system. So when we're feeling stuck, that walk and that bilateral, even at that slow pace, it like can thaw that blockage so well and get us into a different part of our brain body system. So
Mhm.
that's so inspiring to me that you have been doing this for 4 months, and I'm curious what other things you've noticed just in terms of how easily the writing starts to flow when you get back. Like, how has that habit supported you?
Yeah, so for me, this thing can happen when I get on the computer where I kind of get tunnel vision or I get scatterbrained. Like I'm totally guilty of having 25 tabs open at once in my browser, and I'm trying to work on that, right? Like I can just get really all over the place of like, let me go do this, now let me do that. And when I go take a walk, it helps me just get rid of those blinders and see the horizon in the distance and kind of take a breath and be able to focus quite a bit better. So I'll often use that time in my walk to just kind of, let the dust settle, like let everything filter and get down to the core of, okay, what is it that I'm going to go sit down and write? Or, what are my top priorities today? Instead of feeling like I need to do everything all at once. So we know that that doesn't work, right? Like multitasking is not, it's not a thing.
It's not, and I, as a ADHD Gemini, really used to like to make the argument, "Oh, I'm good at multitasking," and, the more that I age, the more I'm like, "Yeah, that was really an excuse that just hurdled me towards burnout." And so I love that, you've really spoken to the clarity of getting away from screens
Mhm.
because, I mean, this is something I'm so passionate about. We're so addicted to screens.
Yes.
Myself as well, right? Like, I'm continually finding myself doing the doom scroll and like, "No, no, no, let's stop that." Like, it's
Mhm.
a habit that we really have to work to break now, but it does disrupt our ability to connect with that creative flow. And so as you were talking, my friend Mary Gooden, who's also a published author and publisher herself, she wrote this little affirmations book. And one of
Mhm.
the affirmations that I really like in there that I just would love to invite everybody to consider is, show me the way, what is mine to share today? Like that, when you're out walking, it's like you're getting that show me the way. Like, what am I meant to share today? What am I writing about? What needs to come through?
Mhm.
And that gets us away from some of the clutter. Because I'm imagining, I know that you're like me and you've published quite a few things and like you have more projects coming down the pike. We can have so many things stacked up that we want to share that we can immediately get overwhelmed and not know where
Yeah.
to start. So, really asking that clarifying question of like, what is here to be shared today is something that can help us kind of sort through some of that extra clutter.
Mhm. Yeah. I don't know if you ever heard of the book, The Perfectionist Guide to Losing Control, but she talks
Mm.
about these different personas, like different types of perfectionists. And I'm the messy perfectionist, which means I like to start things. And yeah, so that's
Come to
something I
me.
try to work on is just like I have a document with book titles, you probably have the same where you just have all these different books you'd like to write. But the question becomes, which one am I working on now?
Yep.
Like you said, you kind of have to find ways to focus and
That's hard, especially if we're multi-passionate creatives or we have so many ideas. You're totally right. I literally have a spreadsheet called Projects Master List. It has blog ideas, it has short story ideas, it has novel ideas, it has nonfiction book ideas. Like, it's got it all in there. because I'm a polymath and like to do it all. Like I write in pretty much every genre, but that's exactly it. And I noticed I had this pressure of like, well, I need to share the nonfiction first because that's going to help more people or it's going to reach more people.
Mhm.
And then I thought about that. Like I had to do some shadow work around that. And I'm like, oh, that's just a story I'm telling myself because how many of us have been impacted by a work of fiction or a
Mhm.
poem in the most profound ways, right? Like,
Absolutely.
so that was literally, I just needed to get out of that therapist mindset of like, oh, well, I should be writing this. And that was a big thing in discerning my projects. So how do you have ways that you kind of discern?
Well, I wanted to ask you that question too. Maybe I'll flip it to you after I answer. This thing happens to me where a project, it'll feel like it's sitting right here. Like I wake up in the morning, it's there. I go about my day, it's there. Like the ideas are just right there, kind of
Mhm.
like an unignorable feeling to it. And that's usually how I know, okay, this is next in the queue. Like it's very front and center. And it'll feel like downloads that are coming in here and there throughout the day. Kind of where it's like, oh, let me get my phone and write that down, or like, let me jot that on a sticky note. You know, my husband would tell you just little sticky notes all over the place in our house. It's like you got to capture it when it comes through because you don't want to lose that. Um,
Yeah, I have a stack right here.
yeah.
I so you get this pressure almost like this is the urge.
Yeah, and it doesn't even feel like pressure. It almost just feels like it's present there.
Present.
It's something that's almost like, when you see something in your peripheral vision, it's like an awareness that's there. Um,
Mm.
yeah, it's usually low pressure, but an urgency in a good way that feels like, ooh, I want to work on that right now because it just feels very alive in this
Yes.
moment.
That makes sense. Yeah. For me, trying to discern, first of all, I've learned to not force myself to pick one project because for me, if I'm feeling really stuck in one, it's
Mm,
useful for me to be able to pivot and go look at the other one for a bit. So I've learned to really highlight two. So
mhm,
right now, my two projects are my next poetry book, which is called Daddy's Girl, a poetry book about daddy issues, if that was not apparent enough, and then a workbook, which is a nonfiction. And so it was like, okay, I'm giving some attention to this urgency I feel towards helping people directly. And then I'm also the reason Daddy's Girl was the next one for me is it's been sitting in the docket the longest with the most
mhm,
amount of work done on it. So when I was like, okay, what am I finishing next? Because that was actually a shadow cycle I just worked on, was the
mhm.
abandoning the projects, just like you were saying, the messy perfectionism. Like I start it and then it sits there.
Yeah.
And then I start a new thing and it sits there. So Daddy's Girl was like, it's been sitting there since my father passed in 2021. I had
Wow.
basically written the whole book while he was actively passing. And then right after he passed, I finished it. And then I was like, man, no, I'm not going to look at you because I'm not ready. Right. And so now I'm like ready to move on with sci-fi, but I'm like, but I feel the ambient energy that's being pulled towards this project. And so that's something like I really want people to look up and pay attention to is like when you don't finish something, whether it be answering an email, whether it be, you're painting your kitchen, whatever it is that you're waiting, it's just sitting in the queue, is it is still taking up energy. It's just energy that you're like, yeah, I'll do it when I have the energy, but you're still reserving the energy
Mhm.
for it. And so it's this endless drain. And I really was like, I need to stop doing that. So I want to wrap up the projects that are already sitting there almost done. That's where I'm at.
I like that. You don't hear that talked about very much. And I'm really glad to meet you because you're very unique and more like me than I feel most people are in terms of the amount of projects you have going and have, put out into the world. It's like most people, well, a lot of people are trying to write their one book that they're ever going to write, you know. And in my journey as an editor, I feel like one of the most common questions I get is, how do I know that it's done? And I think this ties in with what you were just talking about, where we can play that game of saying it's never done, but really we're just avoiding letting it go, or,
Yeah.
pushing it to that final finish line. Yeah, I can definitely relate to that. I think it's a tough decision to make, and in some ways, you could spend your whole life just re-editing and changing your mind on something. So it's a
Yeah.
great skill to be able to say, this is done, or at least this is done for now, moving it on to the next step, or, you know, getting it
Right.
out there so I can go to the next project. Because like you said, it's still holding your energy if it's unfinished.
It holds so much energy when it's unfinished, like, and that took me a long time to recognize. So if you're like, "What is she talking about?" Don't worry, just start to notice. But yeah, I am definitely not a one and done book kind of person. I know that I'm just getting started. I've been in 6 anthologies and then the 2 solo books so far, and that's been in 2 years while not focusing on my writing. So I'm like,
Oh,
what what's possible for me if I was focusing on my writing?
mhm.
And then that gets into, going back to our sort of core topic here, the creative and wellness piece, because each thing that I put out into the world peels back another layer of self-work that I need to do, right? For me, I was like, "Oh, if I can publish my novel and rip that Band-Aid off, like, now I can publish more novels. Oh, if I can publish a really personal poetry book, I can publish anything really personal." And so I'm like, yay. But then I go to the next project and I'm like, oh, there's still some visibility stuff here. There's still stuff that we need to work on. And
Mhm.
so the wellness journey is really an ongoing thing with the creativity, regardless of if you're a writer or a painter or whatever. You really need to have this willingness to like check in with yourself. Am I giving away too much energy? Am I scrambling myself? Am I putting so much pressure on myself that this doesn't feel healthy anymore? And those are all considerations that we have to take in. But a question popped in I wanted to ask you, which is because since we do share these similarities, is that when we roll up and we're like, okay, I think it's almost done. And I have that feeling too. Like I'm like, is this book completely done? And I have that recognition. If I really wanted to, I could come back and I could edit and republish another version later, first of all. But when I've had the experience of going to click that, like, done button and submit to publish, it's the most anticlimactic thing in the world for me because I've already done the work up front, and I'm wondering what that's like for you.
Yeah, that's funny that you mentioned that. There, well, yeah, I can agree with that. I've had that feeling of, it's just all the excitement kind of already happened in terms of the lead up. Um, and then obviously you move into a phase of other people responding and reacting, so that's new. But I was also going to say that there's been a period of grief around, hitting done, hitting publish, it being that phase being closed out. Because it's like something you've been holding so dear and working so intimately with, this project. And then when it's over, you're like, what do I do now? And I think that's where you move into the launch side of it, which, it's a more interactive, connecting type of phase. But I think that's why I'm always writing the next thing, is because I would be so sad if it was over, like I could never just stop. How would you do that? Like, I still need to say things.
That's
So,
so funny. I literally launched my poetry book at the end of January, February, March, April, May. May, yes. I was like, wait a minute, we need to do the calendar here. So I launched it right at the end of May, and then June I stepped back and I took a sabbatical.
mhm.
And during that sabbatical, I started to write a short story and I was like, no, we're not, no, it's not happening. And I like let my writing completely go.
Wow.
And all of these ideas are coming in, and I literally have Daddy's Girl, like the printed out draft with sticky notes on it where I've been smacking, like, oh, do a poem about this, like, add this. But like, I haven't been doing any writing. And
Hmm.
that's other than journaling. If you count that as writing. But that in of itself was such an interesting process. I love that you said, like, I don't know what to do because I've been sitting with that discomfort. And it is a discomfort to be such a creative person and not be creating in the way that's authentic to you. I was creating, but like more in a I need to do this for my business, and I wasn't focused on my writing
Yeah.
ventures at all. So it was uncomfortable. Not
Hmm.
recommended.
Yeah. Learning to trust the ebbs and flows is hard, you know, especially when, like you said, you have something you want to write, but you realize it's not the right time. So there's
Mhm.
a patience involved. And patience is one of my biggest struggles in this lifetime.
Me
That's
too.
I think we were talking about that. I self-publish because I am not patient enough to wait however long it would take.
Well, who knows how long it would take with a traditional publisher. And, I'd love to talk about that. So you chose self-publishing because of a time component. I
Mhm,
think one of the main reasons that I chose to self-publish was actually to maintain the authenticity of my voice
mhm,
because I tend to write about things that are taboo. I tend to write about things that are not mainstream, that are considered controversial in some cases.
mhm.
And I really didn't want a traditional publisher to say, we can't publish this. Like, we'll publish the rest of this, but you need to re edit this chapter or remove this part. And that's something that like I just think about it a lot because there are days where I'm like, maybe I'll pitch my sci-fi series to a traditional publisher. And then
Mhm.
I remember hearing like, oh, you can't have an alien main character in a traditional publisher because they want human characters that the readers relate to. Like it was literally a piece of advice I heard while querying and whatnot years ago. And so I
Interesting.
was like, well, I just don't wanna bother then. Like, if anyone's gonna try to police me that much about who can be my characters, like, I don't want anything to do with it.
Mhm.
So, I'm curious, in your experience, so there's the time component, there's the authenticity component. Are there any other main reasons you would suggest someone self-publish versus trying to go the traditional route? Because I have lots of opinions on it.
Yeah, and I love that you have lots of opinions on it. Um, I think, yeah, I think we have to self-advocate as self-published because so many things will lead us down a path of thinking that the traditional is the better route just because it's been there long enough,
Mhm.
or longer. And for me, part of it was just I wanted to learn. I wanted to experiment. And I've recently shifted from just putting things out through Amazon to this latest book. I built a website for it and worked with a different kind of publisher, so that I had experienced that as well. So I think with each book project, I'm wanting to learn and grow and understand how can this shift and change me as a person? How can it teach me about business? How can it, level up different skills? Like I've realized over the years, I like being a do it yourself person. Like I
Mhm.
like knowing how something can get done. And, like building that website, there was some hesitation around the tech side of it, of trying to get different parts hooked up and make sure my business email was working and just these different moments where I'm like, I don't know what I'm doing. And then I realized, well, it's kind of cool that now the book itself, I feel like I know what I'm doing. It's like the website part is hard. Now the book part is easier. So yeah, for me, a lot of it's just about learning and trying new things and wanting to do that myself rather than rely on other people.
Yep. Nope. I resonate with that deeply. I like it was so cool. My novel, I hired someone to do the cover but one of my partners and I, so I'm polyamorous, one of my partners and I did all of the interior layout and editing, and then we had beta readers and whatnot to go through the finalized stuff. But we learned the software. We learned how to then take the cover file that the person had made and make sure it fit the final, and like we learned all of that. And then the second book project, my poetry project, I ended up formatting completely by myself without my partner's help and did my cover. So it
Yeah,
was like
same.
full freedom. Yeah. And it felt so good.
Yeah, and I'm on the cover for this latest one, so that's interesting too. Of just that was from a photo shoot years ago, and yeah, it's so empowering owning all the steps in the process. I mean, it's equally as terrifying because you're like, okay, the responsibility is mine, but I love that. I think it's even more satisfying too at the end because you're like, I literally created this out of nothing. I put together all the pieces and um, you become a more confident person doing that,
Yeah.
and it's worth it.
I definitely agree. And, I always like to caveat here, know your limits, know your skills. Rachel and I are both like, we have a background in English and editing and writing. So, like, this kind of comes more naturally to us. Like, it's something that we picked as a passion. So, if you're like, I want to publish a book, but I've literally never studied English or editing or grammar or web design or software, and you don't want to get into that, like, there are so many people out there to help you do those little piece things, and you
Mm-hmm.
can still create a book and you can still self-publish and you can still do all of those things. You just might need a couple more people helping you out along the way, and there's no judgment. I literally took a course from I called her my sole publisher, the first person I published like all those anthologies with,
Mm-hmm.
and she taught a course on how to self-publish. And so she literally had step by step, like, here's what you do. And so I still invested in some education,
Mm-hmm.
but there's all kinds of tools out there, and that's like what's so fun about being alive right now is you want to create it, you can, like, you
Mm-hmm.
can find the means. So I have one more. I kind of want to ask one more question. You've already answered quite a bit of it, but just to wrap up here, any other practices that you can think of that support your creative process? So you mentioned the walking and the getting out, and also like eliminating distractions when it's time. Like I heard elements of that in there. But what other practices would you offer to someone to support their creativity, whether that be writing or something else?
Yeah, I think a big component is time. And over the last few years, I've thought a lot about my relationship to time and healing that and working on, when thoughts come in of like, I'm behind or I should be farther along or I don't have time for things that I love. I think we live in a very fast-paced world where the message that we see from a lot of society is that we need to hit these markers of success by a certain age and do more, do more, do more. So it's like our calendar itself is a huge factor in producing something like a book, or reaching those different creative goals. And I will readily admit, like, I have a unique life in that I don't have kids. I don't plan to have kids. I'm now full-time freelance, so my schedule is my own. I have complete control over my time, and a lot of people's lives aren't set up that way. Um, but even if you're a busy parent or someone who works 60-hour weeks, like, you can do the things you want to do. It's just going to require some negotiation with yourself, kind of, of what you're putting your time towards.
Right.
So that's just been a healing journey too, of looking at, okay, if I'm telling myself I don't have time for this, is that really true? Or am I just prioritizing other things? And then you look at habits and addiction patterns like Netflix or
Or being on for a business 24/7.
yeah, yeah, overworking. That's
Yeah,
definitely been a pattern of mine that's still in the healing process.
same.
So yeah, I think relationship to time is a big piece of it too.
Yeah, I love that, and I think that that's so true. We can absolutely tell ourselves all kinds of stories about our time, and many of us are living really, really cluttered lives. So that invitation to really step back and look at what our priorities are, I think, is a really important piece. And again, going back to the very beginning route of this conversation, if you feel like junk, right? You feel physically or emotionally like junk, you're not going to feel aligned to move forward with that creative process. So how can you prioritize your time for wellness, for just
Hmm.
taking care of yourself at those fundamental levels to begin with, and then see what ripples out from there?
Hmm.
And that's, I mean, that's the gift, right? The ripple effect of us starting to do work around something, and it begins to have an impact on all these areas of our life. So
Hmm.
thank you so much for this conversation, Rachel. It has been a pleasure, and we have so much in common.
I know. I just have to say, I really appreciate you. I love the energy that you put out when you get online and post or share about your work. And yeah, it's so encouraging and inspiring to see another multi-passionate creative, and like I can tell from you that you have this mindset of if you want to do it, you can do it. And that's something that I truly believe too. And so, yeah, I see that in you and I just get so excited because I'm like, yes, I've been saying this for a long time. Like,
Shout it from the rooftops.
yeah, you're living it, which is so wonderful.
Thank you. I appreciate being witnessed in that way. And again, thank you for all that you do and the way that you boldly stand in line with your work and keep sharing your message and your mission. And I'm sure we'll be collaborating on something in the future.
I would love that.
All right. Well, bye for now, friends. We'll see you back here. If there is a conversation or a person you'd like to see me have a conversation with, let me know. And otherwise,